My friends, as you know, I've reviewed countless war movies on this channel. But today is different, because I flipped the script. Since I'll be reacting to a war movie I actually worked on as a historical consultant. The name of this short film is Corps Franc by up-and-coming movie director Yann Avril.
Corps Franc. En avant.
Link will be in the description below, and make sure to activate CC captions for English subtitles. So in this video I'll tell you about my brutally honest perspective as a historical consultant. That pretty much means I'm gonna roast myself.
Fuck.
I will take the time to reply to some recurrent comments regarding weapons, tactics, uniforms, the casting, and more. Let's jump right in because there's a lot to unpack. First things first, we need some context. Why is the short film called Corps Franc? It all started when I released this video tier list ranking of various World War I movies. November 2022. Man, time flies. That's when Yann Avril, an up-and-coming movie director, reached out to me. His goal was simple: make a realistic film about World War I. And he asked me how to achieve this with a low budget, because he would be financing the entire project from his own pocket. That was a completely new adventure for me. I finally met someone who would take historical accuracy seriously and not simply ask the audience to turn off their brains. So that's why I agreed, and looking back, it was a humbling experience. Anyway, so that's how Yann and I started brainstorming. But quickly enough, being aware of the little means available to him, I recommended a story about the Corps Franc. Not to be confused with the German Freikorps. The Corps Franc were hand-picked elite soldiers from the French army that formed small units tasked with conducting reconnaissance, capturing prisoners for intelligence, and probing enemy defenses. The terms come from franc-tireur, the French word for sharpshooter or irregular fighter. Historically, franc-tireurs were small bands of volunteers who operated behind enemy lines, most famously during the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-1871, when they repeatedly harassed Prussian supply columns and lines of communication. Fast forward to the Great War, 1914-1915. The Western Front grinds to a halt. Both sides dig in and trench warfare takes over. To break the deadlock, French regiments revived the concept of the franc-tireur by forming small specialized assault units known by multiple names, such as Compagnie Franche, Groupe Franc. Pétain would mock them by calling them the gladiators. But today we simply call them the Corps Franc, hence the title of the movie. The biggest advantage of telling a story about the Corps Franc is that it can be filmed with a relatively small cast, making it far more budget-friendly and practical from a production standpoint. But there's more. You can also be creative with missions, weapons, and uniforms. At the same time, it explores a fascinating subject that has received very little attention in cinema, giving audiences something fresh rather than another retelling of mud and trenches. Actually, there's this one French movie that talks about the Corps Franc, and I highly recommend it. It's a 1996 film called Capitaine Conan. It tells the story of a Corps Franc fighting in the mountains of the Balkans in 1918, right at the end of the war. Yann, as a filmmaker, was like, "Say no more, let's go." So I was pretty hyped. Mission success. So the entire project started with Yann and me. And at the end, I think more than 50 people were involved at one point in time. Pretty crazy. Another reason this project was so interesting is that there was very little iconography of the Corps Franc, so we had to start from scratch. You have the idea, now it's actually time to build something out of it. We're in the middle of this creative process, which takes place over multiple months. Lots of hour-long phone calls. And during this period, we're both acquiring a lot of knowledge. I learned a lot about the intricacies of cinema and filmmaking, while he learned about how fighting actually looked like during World War I. To get inspired, I started digging through military archives to look for real missions carried out by Corps Franc units. Nothing better than actual operations. That way you don't have to come up with something out of thin air and end up with something silly. Yann also did great research on his side as he got his hands on multiple first-hand accounts like this very interesting book about the action of a Corps Franc unit in the Vosges Mountains. In 1915, missions mostly consisted of small trench raids, but eventually some large operations were launched. In this document from July 1916, we can read 53rd Infantry Regiment, suggestions for a raid, manpower 40 men, including 1 officer, 2 sergeants, and 6 corporals. Goal: search and destroy German trenches between these positions. And below is a detailed explanation of the entire operation. Essentially, every French regiment was to have its own Corps Franc unit composed of about 40 volunteers. One of the most noteworthy actions by the Corps Franc occurred on the night of the 14th of July 1918. French forces were expecting a large German attack, but needed precise intelligence on enemy preparations. That's when a Corps Franc was sent forward and penetrated deep into German lines. In under 45 minutes, the group returned with 27 prisoners. The intelligence obtained enabled a timely and effective French counter-preparation artillery barrage that disrupted the last attack of the German spring offensive. I was going through all these missions and I was like, wow, that's so cool, it would be amazing in a movie. It's essentially like modern special forces movies, but set in World War I. Now this is where we encountered our first challenge: the inevitable tension between historical accuracy and cinematic storytelling. My role was to preserve authenticity, so from his perspective, I was the annoying historical consultant that set all the guardrails. Essentially, I was Mr. No. Hey Alex, can I do? No. How about? No. Okay, what if we, maybe, but better not. At the same time, that's exactly why Yann wanted me on board, to guide and channel his creative energy. So disagreements between historical consultants and filmmakers is bound to happen. For example, Yann wanted an entire storyline involving an aircraft. I was against it, because it was too complicated and too convoluted. Instead, I suggested a small mission, something very simple, such as storming a German outpost to capture prisoners, and that's it. But he's a filmmaker. For him, that's boring. And maybe he's right. For his film, he wanted to add some shock factor. Because the goal was not to please history nerds, but to get investors hyped up. So a lot of compromises had to be made on both sides. Especially mine. Especially mine. I'm just a consultant. I don't have the final word. I just give advice. So although I was against the aircraft, I tried my best to guide him through this endeavor. For example, right here, the guy who built the wing painted the roundel like this. But that's for the British RAF. It might look counterintuitive, but on the French aircraft, the blue is in the middle. I also recommended him to watch a lot of World War I aviation movies that he didn't know about. There's another discussion that I remember clearly. Yann wanted one of the Corps Franc guys to knife an enemy soldier, and then another, followed by a lot of hand-to-hand combat.
Oh, okay.
Inside I was like, not again. He wanted something that looks cool on screen and that he probably saw in other war movies. Whereas for me, this was so cliché and frankly historically inaccurate. Not that it never happened, but it's anecdotal. And since all the other war movies already covered that topic, I think it's time to think outside the box. Where it gets tricky is that it's true that Corps Franc detachments often posed for pictures with knives, but it was just for show. Joseph Tézenas de Moncel, a French soldier who fought in the infantry from 1915 to 1918, explains it clearly. I'm going to the platoon where they are in the process of distributing knives to the men designated to be trench cleaners. This instrument will be even more useless to them, if that is possible, than the bayonet itself. For my part, I have never known anyone who has witnessed a fight, even a single combat, with the bayonet. Whereas the knife can really only be used by journalists or men of letters in need of horrifying stories. It cannot be clearer than this. To be fair, Yann double-checked with Dimitri Chavaroche, who wrote an entire book on the use of bladed weapons in combat during World War I, and he corroborated what I said. He wrote, however, the accounts rarely mention the use of knives during the fighting and simply reflects its inefficiency and low usage. For this thing, historical consultants were listened to. Because this is a movie trope I'm just tired of seeing. And you will notice that even the movie Capitaine Conan falls into this trap, because the men in his assault detachment constantly make use of knives. So if they didn't use knives, what weapons did they use? Trench raiders avoided rifles, because they're impractical in tight trench networks and close quarters engagements. Also because they're heavy and not prone for infiltration. This official document from a Corps Franc attached to the 248th Infantry Brigade clearly stated, consideration should be given to whether trench-clearing grenadiers should carry rifles or instead be armed only with automatic pistols, so as to maximize their mobility and reduce the weight they must carry. You heard it, the weapon of choice for the Corps Franc were pistols, either revolvers or semi-automatics like the pistolet rubis. Most of the men in these units were labeled as grenadiers. For sure, they were armed with pistols, but especially with huge pouches filled with grenades. The 53rd Infantry's regulations stipulated that each grenadier was to carry 20 offensive grenades. In addition, every assault subgroup was assigned 2 dedicated ammunition bearers whose sole responsibility was to transport large pouches filled with grenades. Pistol and grenade, that's it. Why risk your life in hand-to-hand combat when you can just become a grenade pitching machine? And we can observe how my recommendation for pistol and grenade was very well portrayed in this scene of the short film. In the document, we can also read that the Corps Franc unit was composed of 2 men with FMs, which stands for fusil mitrailleur or light machine guns for fire support, each supplemented by pourvoyeur, an ammo bearer. At last, 4 men were equipped with VBs, meaning the Vivien-Bessières rifle grenade launcher, so you can get an idea of the type of weapons the Corps Franc used during their operations. But of course, the selection varied depending on the mission at hand. So I bombarded Yann with all this information, and he started ordering the firearms. At times, some of the Corps Franc were also armed with carbines like the Berthier Mousqueton, which you can see right here. Although there's a small mistake because he's using a gendarmerie version instead of the cavalry one, which would be more appropriate in a military setting. My bad, I saw the order, but I didn't realize the mistake.
A shameful display!
At that point, we were just happy to have firearms. Originally, the project was envisioned as a full feature film, but eventually we scaled it down into a short film that would serve as a pilot. The goal of a pilot is to demonstrate the story, visual style, and production potential of the project in order to attract investors and secure the funding needed to develop it into a larger feature film. Downsizing also meant reducing the scope of the operation. So instead of a Corps Franc 40 men, there would be only 7. And I said, okay, that's fine. How I saw it is that these guys could be a squad as part of a larger operation. We see an example of this in the following document, where the Corps Franc was to split up inside enemy lines anyway. And you know, as a historical consultant, it's one thing to give advice by saying words, but I always make sure to give some visual examples as well, because at the end of the day, we're talking about a movie. So I recommended him to rewatch the scene from Band of Brothers, where Easy Company launched a night patrol to capture some German prisoners, because I thought it would be good for inspiration. Additionally, all the lore we worked on had to be drastically compressed as well. Downsizing also meant that nobody involved in this project would be paid, which, let me tell you, is a hard sell. This is where passion comes in. But doesn't mean the movie's free. We talked about the firearms, that there are multiple dozens of people present on set. They have to be housed and fed. You have to rent cameras and all the gear for lighting and sound. It all adds up. Filmmaking is an expensive hobby. So I'm very proud to say that everyone that was involved in Corps Franc was passionate about World War I, and from a purely technical perspective, they all did an amazing job. Now that you're familiar with the context, let's enter some of the feedback and comments from the audience about the short film.
Very well. Where do I begin?
Some of them mentioned the lack of stealth walking in the water. Well, the short answer is production nightmare. Here's what happened. When preparing such a movie, you need a filming location. Ideally a place that has not been altered by modernity. Yann met this older gentleman who liked his project, and he offered his country house for a couple days. Can you imagine that? Heritage building with a huge backyard all the way to a river. Perfect. And for free! As you can see here, we had a huge playground available. That's where I went to the drawing board and planned the maneuver. The idea was for the Corps Franc to approach a river, cross it, and storm a German outpost in the woods. So for some time we discussed of how we can make this happen from a technical perspective. In January 2024, Yann and his crew went on location to scout the area. After he sent me the footage, I analyzed everything carefully and adapted my scenario to the terrain. Once again, personally from a historical standpoint, all these details that I talked about in this video were very important for me. For Yann, who was script writer, producer, director, it was only part of the project. He already had a lot on his plate. This was his first project of this scale. Before D-Day, he had to coordinate rehearsals with the actors, organize the logistics, secure all the gear, make sure the uniforms fit, and so on. I will just summarize this part as it's a lot of work. But there's more. In the last few weeks before D-Day, things went very fast. Turns out I wasn't included in the creation of the shooting schedule. One reason is because I don't live in France. But you know what? To be honest, I didn't even know this document existed until a couple days ago. It's actually super important in cinema. It's the movie's roadmap of everything that is going to be filmed at each hour of the day. If your idea is not in the shooting schedule, it's not gonna be in the movie. It's also where a lot of the details, the tactics, the movements are gonna be studied and prepared. Yeah, I don't know what to tell you. Now, with that being said, I managed to go through the document, and I can say with confidence that Yann absorbed a lot of my teachings. The hundreds of hours paid off. Sadly, the reality is that historical consultants are rarely involved in this very important part of the process. This is just how the industry works. Often by the time historical consultants show up, barely anything can be changed apart from some dialogue and small details on set. Imagine you show up, the uniforms are wrong, the firearms are wrong. Everybody's gonna be like, yeah, too bad, this is what we're gonna work with today. Anyway, D-Day kept getting delayed for various reasons. But eventually the date was set for early April, only 2-3 months after scouting the area. Day 1, Yann reaches the location, and everything is flooded! What a disaster! Water absolutely everywhere. The big backyard is all but a swamp. The river, the forest, it's all underwater.
Faut savoir si avec des bottes comme ça on peut aller jusqu'au bout là-bas. Enfin au moins jusqu'à la moitié quoi.
That's when Yann asked himself, what do I do? He couldn't cancel because everyone was already on their way. It was already a blessing that they all showed up. Not only that, all the firearms, uniforms, and gear were also only rented for that week. So he had no other choice but to improvise, adapt to the current reality, and come up with something on the spot. In a way, this is what an actual Corps Franc mission would look like. You have the initial plan, everything turns to shit for some reason, and you need to adapt to the new reality ASAP. I don't know how they managed to do it, but they found boats. That's how the camera crew ended up paddling through the swamp. Let's just say the actors spent a lot of time knee-deep in water. Looks like a fishing trip. The water situation also led to a mutiny, but that's not my story to tell. Let's just say that this was quite of a baptism of fire for Yann as a filmmaker. With that being said, it's undeniable that the water gave a certain aesthetics to the entire thing. And many people praised this aspect of the movie in the comments. That unfortunate situation also meant that the original storyboard and tactical situation I carefully prepared were all thrown out of the window. It was irrelevant now. It sucks because just like that, my contribution to the project dramatically diminished. When I told Yann about all this a couple of days ago, he replied that yeah, it sucks. But his entire shooting schedule also went straight to the garbage. It became a free-for-all. Yann, the crew, and the actors essentially rewrote the entire film the day of, for better or worse. I remember reading some comments that complained about the lack of realism in combat scenes. Well, you know what I tell them? They're absolutely right. Nobody called or contacted me to fact-check whatever they were doing on set. One of the reasons is because on day 1, Yann's phone fell in the water. GG, well played. I only got news from him on day 3 or 4. From his perspective, the objective was just to get filming done. What's funny is that even the actors on set were laughing at the terrible tactical decisions made by the lieutenant. And spoilers, that's why almost everyone ended up dead. Looking back, I think I should have been there. Maybe I could have had some impact. The reason I wasn't present is purely financial. With a budget of 2 shoestrings, do you really think they could fly me in at the last minute all the way from Canada? For sure I could have paid for all the expenses myself. Let's be honest, it's a big commitment with a lot of unknowns. Anyway, yeah, I don't know, maybe I should have. Anyway, it's not too bad, it's okay, I can be available remotely. It's not as if the filming crew would completely forget about me, right? A lot of the criticism in the comment section is valid. Let's be honest, the storyline doesn't make sense. If the Corps Franc already had their German prisoner, it's mission accomplished. Now their goal is just to return to base so headquarters can interrogate the prisoner. It doesn't make sense at this point to risk everything to both capture a camera, that is, by the way, conveniently preserved from the crash and from the water, and whose content is completely unknown, while simultaneously clear a house full of Germans. You could have 100 enemy riflemen in this area. Do you really think a Corps Franc would launch an attack against a fortified position without carrying out some reconnaissance before? It doesn't make sense. it's also a bit ridiculous that none of the Germans inspected the aircraft that crashed right next to them. The guys are just having breakfast. The German officer doesn't even acknowledge the huge aircraft. Actually, that's why I was against the entire aircraft storyline. Okay, but let's imagine I'm present on set, and I have no other choice but to take into account the water and the aircraft. Personally, I think the plot would have been much more interesting if a German patrol was sent to inspect the crash site, that they noticed the camera, and as they approached the swamp to get their hands on it, the French soldiers returned from their mission with their prisoner. In this situation, the French soldiers would have no other choice but to engage the German patrol, and this could also explain the messy nature of the firefight. It was truly unexpected. This new storyline would have also removed the need to build fortifications for the Germans, because sandbags on the terrace really, it looks a bit cheap. But once again, I understand why they did it. Initially, the Corps Franc was supposed to storm a German outpost in the woods, with dugouts and everything. Not possible in a swamp. I'm confident that with more time and more budget, we could have created something realistic like this picture, where we see a combination of trenches, sandbags, and firing positions. In this other part, the unit launches the attack from way too far. There's no way the Corps Franc can achieve surprise without the Germans noticing them. In the original storyboard, it made more sense because the French were to cross the river under the cover of an artillery barrage. Again, here they take aim, but from what? 100 meters away? Look how far from the house the lieutenant is positioned. And they're all firing while standing up. Good luck with precision, especially with mad recoil. And considering they don't even have a direct line of sight on the Germans. At least these guys are sort of camouflaged by the high grass. Sort of. But overall, it doesn't feel like the action of a commando unit, you know? And that's a problem when your film is called Corps Franc. In the past few days, I rewatched the short film over and over, and I kept asking myself, what went wrong? Here's the answer. We can observe how the entire squad is armed with rifles. Where are the pistols we talked about earlier? That's when a couple days ago, I rechecked all the firearms that were rented for the movie. Everything was there. 5 Lebel rifles, 5 Mousqueton Berthier M16, 2 semi-automatic pistols Ruby, 1 revolver 1892, 3 revolvers 1870, of course the Shosha LMG that I constantly had to hammer to be included in the movie, and plenty of grenades. So what went wrong? Either the armorer made a mistake and not all the weapons were available on set. That's definitely a possibility. But I think that since the field was flooded, and since this was Yann's first big movie, there was a bit of chaos on set on day one. Yann was overloaded, had to direct a lot of people, too many people in a way. And the armorer simply handed rifles to the actors. Nobody provided him with instructions, so he did what he knew best of World War I. I think it's as silly as that. That's an example of my inexperience. I was isolated. I should have insisted on not only having the phone numbers of people like lead roles and armorers, but also to discuss historical realism with them weeks in advance. The problem is that this mistake would trickle down, because the moment they started shooting the first scenes with the rifles, then it's too late. Even had they called me, you can't just switch the rifles for pistols anymore. I should have been there. At the same time, good thing I saved all that money, because the last-minute care package was desperately needed. I ended up financing the food supply of the operation. Anyway, as a result of the actors using rifles, multiple elements regarding tactics became unrealistic. Pistols would have naturally forced the actors to be positioned much closer to the house before launching the attack, meaning they would have needed to approach the German position with stealth, and they would have benefited from the element of surprise. Here you see what I mean, the soldiers are firing from afar, while the captain goes on a frontal attack by himself, fully exposed. There's no fire and maneuver whatsoever, no flanking attack through the woods. Normally the guy with the light machine gun should have pushed forward with the captain. That's the entire point of this weapon. I clearly remember that this was in the original storyboard. It wasn't done because that's why. Look, maybe I'm nitpicking, because to have the FM in support at the rear is not terrible either. I think if the captain would have pushed forward with at least 2 other men, it would have been much more realistic already. Especially, I repeat, considering an entire farmhouse had to be cleared. And you don't know how many Germans are inside. And hold on, now that I think about it, when the captain charged forward on his own, What was the lieutenant doing? Tactically, if they want to secure the camera, okay, let's say they have to clear the house first. Then they should all be involved in this mission. Why is the captain running by himself against the house, while the lieutenant is running towards the camera? Yeah.
Madness.
I think it would have been much more interesting if you had all the guys with the rifles providing suppressive fire on the Germans, and then you have a three-man team, the guy with the FM, the lieutenant, and the captain, flanking the house from the left and then clearing it, all the while throwing a ton of grenades. Especially since Mr. Machine Gun was the guy with all the grenades around his neck. Some comments also mentioned how Corps Franc units would typically operate at night, not in daytime. Yes, I agree, this is true. This is not my field of expertise, but from what I've been told, filming at night is very expensive. It requires special lighting. That also means electric cables everywhere, which by the way is not advisable in an area that is completely flooded. That means you need waterproof cables. The budget would have just exploded. On top of that, it was already hard to manage multiple dozens of people in daytime. Imagine now everyone running around on set in the water and in the dark with flashlights. All this to say it was way too complicated for a short film. So why not film at dusk or at dawn? In this case, it's a time constraint. You can only film a few hours per day and it's not efficient. Ah, uniforms! Many people in the comments pointed out that the white kepi was historically inaccurate. This is a valid complaint. It was deliberate. Obviously, for me, this was heretical, but look. For Yann, as a filmmaker, the idea was to show that the men in the Corps Franc were allowed to do things that other soldiers couldn't. A bit like Spec Ops operators in the modern age. He also wanted each character to have a distinct visual identity that audiences could immediately recognize. So for example, this is why you have Mr. Red Pants. There's an entire backstory, but there's no time in the short film to introduce it. The giant with the sheepskin. It's actually similar to the one you can see in this picture. Yann also insisted on showing the diversity of France. Not the modern diversity, but the ancestral regional diversity of the country. The giant is from Brittany. This man is Corsican. And of course, why not someone from the French Foreign Legion? By the way, it's only recently that I noticed that the actor doesn't have any accent associated with someone serving in the French Foreign Legion. That's because in the initial storyline of the short film, he wasn't supposed to talk. But the actor said if he's not paid, at least he wants to showcase his skills. Yep. Good point. But it's still funny that nobody on set told the Legionnaire to have some sort of accent. You see, these are the small details where I wish I was there physically to guide certain aspects of the story. Okay, back to his uniform. Is it historically accurate? Yeah, but not for World War I. The iconic white kepi of the French Foreign Legion was only standardized in 1939. This is what the uniforms of legionnaires would have actually looked like during the Great War. To be honest, I think close enough. Although some others say the color was actually horizon blue. It all depends if they fought on the Western Front or in the Balkans. But anyway, realistically, nobody would wear a kepi during a trench raid. Same for the captain. Looks cool, but not accurate. And it also just makes you a bigger target for the enemy. Another comment that I saw come up often was that too many of the cast were old. Yeah, that's a bit of my fault. Sort of. During World War I, all the members of the Corps Franc were volunteers, but there was no standardized selection process. The main criteria required candidates to have combat experience, to be physically fit and agile, psychologically aggressive yet disciplined, and to possess special skills such as marksmanship. Once again, it's not very different from special operations units today. But that's not exactly the type of characters we see in the short film. Now, during my research on the Corps Franc, I discovered the fascinating story of Arthur Isidore Dumas. Get this, he died in 1916 during the Battle of the Somme at the age of 68. He was 68 years old. He first fought in Mentana with the Pontifical Zouaves in 1867. He was then wounded during the 1870 Franco-Prussian War. That wasn't over for him since he would fight at Sedan a couple months later, escape from captivity, and continue fighting until the end of the war. And then he took part in France's colonial adventures by serving in Tunisia, Gabon, Ivory Coast, and Sudan. But he wanted more. So in 1900, he left the French army and volunteered to fight with the Boers in South Africa against the British, where he was also wounded. In the end, in 1914, he re-enlisted in the French army, where he regained his rank of captain. He witnessed all the big battles, the Marne, Verdun, and ultimately the Somme. Yann absolutely loved this story, thought it was a banger, so it's an homage in his honor that one of the actors is older, or maybe more than one, okay? Once again, this is a character that exists in the lore of the Corps Franc project, but in a short film, there's just no time to introduce everyone. As you can imagine, I wasn't involved in casting, so I can't say much. But I understood that it's very difficult to find actors that are willing to join the project without being paid. So eventually, if you want to move forward, you have to take in whoever signs up. And without a doubt, Yann cast the actors very carefully because they all performed the roles exceptionally well. Someone else in the comments also asked why there were no reenactors on set. Well, of course, this is one of the first things Yann and I thought about. He reached out to multiple World War I reenactors since they already owned the uniforms, equipment, and weapons needed for the film. They were all hyped up about the project and seemed generally interested in helping. But when the time came, nobody showed up. Everyone had a last-minute excuse, and that's how one by one they all disappeared. And to be fair, we can understand their situation. Most of them have regular 9-to-5 jobs, and joining a film for several days without pay is a big commitment. But at the same time, they knew the expectations from the beginning. Obviously, it was a disappointment, but this is the reality of doing a movie with a very limited budget. That's how Yann, the filmmaker, had to jump into a uniform and play that soldier. There was a similar problem with the German officer role. The actor who was supposed to play him cancelled at the last minute. I think some health issue or something. That's when Yann, while directing, I don't know exactly how he pulled it off, but he contacted Pierre Kivit, a well-known French-German actor. Maybe you might have seen him on Netflix. The guy was immediately excited about the project and accepted on the spot. Only problem, he was in vacation with his family in London. He left the next morning, took the train, drove across France, paid for all the expenses up front, did his scenes, and then returned to London. What a Chad, absolute commitment. It puts me to shame. But honestly, his presence and charisma can be felt the moment he appears on screen. In conclusion, I'm happy to have participated in this Corps Franc project. I was involved from the very beginning up until the end. Despite my inexperience, I believe I fulfilled my role of historical consultant by helping refine the script, finding reference materials, advising on period details, answering various queries, and checking rough cuts. It was an honor that Yann reached out to me specifically, but it was also a humbling experience as I saw how difficult it is to make a war movie. Sometimes during my research, I was just overwhelmed by just how much I didn't know, and about how much I still had to learn about World War I, such as uniforms and weapons. So thankfully, Yann found specialists for each one of these categories. Looking back, I do think that some things could have been improved. Of course, apart from a very limited budget and time constraints. First of all, I think I could have had a much bigger role in the script and overall storyline. That would have definitely helped with authenticity. But it's not my movie. And you learn very quickly that when you're a historical consultant, you're really just there as an advisor. Your power is limited. The only difference in movies is how much they listen to you. Another improvement would have been my presence on set. Some mistakes could have definitely been avoided, like pistols instead of rifles, tactics, and just general realism. I could have even provided last-minute advice on the storyline. And now that I think about it, I could have even served as an extra as well, although not sure I would have been able to fit in the uniforms. I think the fact that nobody on set called any historical consultant also impacted the final result. And in the end, everyone just winged it. Another is the editing process. How do I know this? Well, when I last saw Yann in June, I also met Kevin, the captain in the movie. We were discussing what could have been done better, especially in terms of the combat scenes. That's when Kevin asked Yann, why didn't you include the sequence where I explained the battle plan to my unit before attacking the house? And I'm listening to this and I'm like, what? I wasn't shown all the scenes that were filmed during that week. I only saw the first cut. Apparently some very good scenes were thrown out by the editor. The worst is that the guy did have industry experience, he's not a newbie. He worked on the editing of multiple action movies, but I don't know, he just wasn't the right fit for this project. No jokes, he actually thought this was a movie about World War II. And then his replacement didn't understand that this was actually a war movie. So a lot of good stuff got chopped away and just lost. Anyway, I didn't plan on making such a long video about this short film, and I think I managed to cover everything around it. Now that you know the ins and outs of the project, I'm curious to hear your feedback. Make sure to check out the short film Corps Franc link is in the description below. That's all I have for you today. See you in the next one.